Cool, thank you. Hey everybody. Today I'm Aaron Carey, and today I'm going to be sharing with everybody just sort of some sort of gotchas and stuff I realized with dealing with GraphQL from editor extensions. From editor extensions, you tend to have different deployments of GitLab, and that could be Community Edition, Enterprise Edition, which all of us are obviously very familiar with developing for Enterprise Edition. But one of the things I've noticed as we've been using extensions, I've just seen more and more issues coming in from users. And those issues are pertaining to just different GraphQL fields missing, for example. And that's something just with the way we're testing it and the way we're sort of using this non-version GraphQL. One of the benefits of GraphQL, for folks who aren't familiar, is that you don't have to worry so much about versions. And so the way this sort of like ends up, like how that the impact of that means is you have GraphQL, so you have your query language and this sort of schema that you can build up. And so there's a GitLab schema where we'd find that in the monolith in GitLab org slash GitLab. And so we define this GraphQL schema, and that's sort of like a living document. So we're continuously adding in new schema types and everything. And so when we look at GitLab.com, that's usually on the latest and greatest. So GitLab.com, if we're developing toward GitLab.com, we can use everything, and everybody has every field we can expect. And if a team develops a new field for us to access from the API, as when developing editors or editor extensions, you very quickly are able to use a field such as like duo features enabled, and you get the sort of latest and greatest fields. But the sort of what this ends up meaning is while we're developing for the latest and greatest, sometimes we forget to stop and listen to our users. When we stop and look at what our users are actually using, we find that a lot of folks are on self-managed, 2 or 3 milestones behind sometimes. When we think of the likes of dedicated, GitLab dedicated folks are 1 milestone behind perpetually. And so there we have folks that are perpetually behind the latest and greatest release. GitLab.com is running the pre-release of the next milestone at all times. So if we're developing towards GitLab.com, we end up leaving some users behind and giving users a bad experience where different things, fields they think may be accessible, aren't there. So whenever we do a query, if we're adding fields into these queries, the query immediately starts breaking for different users. If we go to the VS Code project, for example, we can see that very recently there's been issues around GraphQL. Fortunately, some of these have been closed now, but we can see here there's issues even from community members mentioning GraphQL breaks backwards compatibility with self-hosted GitLab, GraphQL breaks compatibility with Community Edition with free users. And that's what we're seeing because we're developing with GitLab.com and our own access that we are able to test and see, hey, for my machine it works. And for different people around the company, it seems to work for their environments. And at the end of the day, we end up giving things, whether it's access credentials, and we're like generating a personal key with scopes that are more that have more access than what we recommend users. Or if there's cases of certs saying that, hey, for this particular editor version, we don't want you using API access because there's a known vulnerability in the editor version, then we may be asked to revoke those keys and then give less permissions. So the likes of like read API or the API scopes, if you grant those, you may be able to do one thing, but if you don't have that level of access, your experience and your responses from the GraphQL API would be totally different. And so more or less the point of the sort of the talk before I just show like some code and ideas around what a future solution might look like. The moral of the story is today, when we're doing GraphQL queries, maintainers need to be very aware of when we're accepting new GraphQL queries. We need to make sure that folks are considering all of the circumstances that someone may be connecting to a GraphQL server. So we consider what if they're a milestone behind, what if there are several milestones behind. Those different requests all need to be put into the workflow that we're giving users. So in the case of a recent example would be Duo Code Suggestions. Duo Code Suggestions became a paid feature, and when that happened, there was a new API introduced a couple of milestones back, but not for all customers. And so that key, that field in GraphQL, you could ask underneath your current user, and from there you can say, hey, give me the duo features, the duo like duos code suggestions enabled. And so if we look here, and can I just confirm y'all are seeing the I have two windows up. Can we confirm I'm seeing like GraphQL API resources on the screen as I'm sharing?
Yeah, yep, we can.
Yes.
Perfect. Sweet. So yes, so if we look at one of the duo fields, we can see quickly here, we can say, hey, you looked great. I have a duo features enabled field. But if we continue through though, you can see that in some cases those fields have a warning on them. And those warnings are related to this having been introduced in a particular version. And so that instantly means that whenever you're developing something for an editor extension, if you do a GraphQL query, that query could break in unexpected ways. It's actually fairly predictable the way it will break. And I can show that, but essentially these fields we keep adding a lot of experimental fields in, and every time we add a new field, not even if it's experimental, even if we add a field into a new version of the GraphQL schema, any field that isn't defined as being nullable will break backwards compatibility. And any queries, if you develop a query and you include a new field in the query that didn't exist, and you make a request against the old version of GitLab, then that query will instantly fail, and the whole query will fail because the error will bubble up to the top. So even though GraphQL is meant to support its ability to have errors but also give back partial data, including these experimental fields immediately breaks the entire query because the query is invalid. So the validation will cut off and just not do any of the like resolvers. Like the resolvers won't run if schema validation fails. And so because of that we need to develop these queries that we're building from extensions and even like different clients as well, that you need to make sure that when you query those, you're considering, hey, what GitLab version is this person connected to? As well as we also have the ability from the metadata API. There's a REST API for metadata, which most keys have access to through like testing of different keys and access levels. The metadata API gives access to like enterprise yes or no, and that gives you the ability of like telling if the distribution is community or enterprise, and that alone is enough to say like ultimate only features or premium only features would not be available to somebody that's running community edition. And so when you're developing, if there's views and stuff like that, one of the like a good example would be the current branch view in the VS Code extension. Super popular view. But with that view, what ends up happening is we released a new thing. There was about 6 milestones ago, we released a API. And so we started getting three or four requests came in really quickly after an updated VS Code went out, where the current branch view broke. And then even looking back, there's a community, there's a message about it, like previously for 6 months, it went untriaged because the error message and the title from user was error and it was very cryptic. And the user said, hey, I'm on free, and I don't seem to be able to figure out what went wrong here. But when we actually look at the JSON response, instead of looking at the error message and what the user said, it's very clear that it was like it's because of a breaking schema change. Luckily, other community contributors replied to them, get workarounds. There's workarounds available there, and that's probably why it didn't become more apparent to developers like working on the project. But for several months, this security pipelines feature and that was broken. So then we go from the pipelines feature being broken into moving some of that into the current branch feature, which is a much more popular. And then because the field didn't exist, or some GraphQL incompatibility with different versions for self-managed, you end up getting more requests of people saying, "Hey, this feature didn't work," and you're getting like user impacting issues more quickly. Um, so what do we have today around this then? We have inside of our GraphQL docs, we mention we mentioned that there's this ability for like we sort of talk about breaking changes, and hey, even though it's a versionless API and it's meant to be API backwards compatible, it's sort of backwards compatible within the instance that you're talking to. So if you're talking to a GitLab instance at your job and it's a self-managed instance, and then you do a new release, then you will know based on our deprecation policy and removal policy that your query should continue working unless it's experimental, in which case it's exempt. And those experimental fields are not considered to be supported or within the normal deprecation removal process. If it's marked as deprecated because it's an alpha feature or an experiment feature, we could just remove that like tomorrow. So the next release, that could break all of the, like a user's automation that they have built internally into their workflows. And that's especially true for editor extensions, where if we're using these sort of Duo AI feature-centric keys, a lot of these are being marked as experimental. And so off the back of that, then we do have an ability which is like I don't think it's super well known, but if you're making queries to GraphQL, you can actually add in a query parameter. The query parameter is remove deprecated, and if you make a query to GraphQL using remove deprecated true, it will simulate your query as if all the deprecated fields in the schema are removed. So it hides all the deprecated fields, and that is just a very quick way. If you have integration tests or end-to-end tests that hit the GraphQL API with the queries that you have for your users, you'll quickly see, hey, my users that aren't on this version, like that is marked as sort of like experimental since 16.9, for example, like if they're not on that version or newer, then it would fail. And if we remove them in the future, what type of failures would my application produce? And so being able to think about like those future breaking changes, um, is super useful for most teams developing. But then when we look at editor extensions, because we have to support such a variety, we have to support a variety of different extension versions. Not all the time do we have our users up to date. So we have to sort of like put a policy and like issue templates in place to sort of like triage, hey, what version of the extension are you using? Okay. What version of GitLab are you using? Are you using Enterprise Edition? Okay. And then we go into authentication scopes, etc. afterwards. But it ends up becoming this process where we have to triage, and issue can take going, it can be back and forth several times around these things. And as we slowly start getting these fields and we slowly have customers upgrading to the later versions of GitLab, we're getting more of an ability to help self-service. But at the minute, it's very much back and forth with ourselves or support in some cases. Um, so again, for like just in terms of this page, we have this verify against like future breaking schema changes, and I think it's a great start whenever we're thinking about things. But we also have to think about verifying queries against old versions as well. And so whenever we think of old versions as well as community edition, like the separate distribution, because not all queries are built equally. When we're building these queries, we have to consider what whenever we're going through, um, and at what point, like what the failure points can be. Um, so if I look, one recent example I can look at is within JetBrains. So inside of the JetBrains code base, and Laura, if you're watching, sorry in advance for using your MR as an example. What we have though is we have one of the teams provided two different functionalities, one REST API, and that REST API could fail with different status codes. But the alternative is using GraphQL. And for JetBrains, the JetBrains plugin has less functionality than say VS Code. VS Code has quite a broad set of permissions because it has the API scope. And so what we end up getting into is a situation where we need to know exactly what scopes the users may have. We look at these the projects so that you have the sort of like happy path if you have access to GraphQL. So if you have read API at least, um, then if you have read API, then you would assume that you can hit all the project fields. So whenever we're testing, you get back all of these things immediately. But what you don't get is the sort of like not happy path cases. So one of the sort of like things to be testing against is whenever we're building integration testing and end-to-end testing, we always need to look at simulating not having those fields available. And so what ends up happening, and again, I mentioned that it was predictable what the error would be, but it's not predictable when the error will occur. So we have the case of you end up getting a JSON response that looks like this, where you get an errors array. It tells you the query, your operation name that you're dealing with. This happens for mutations as a super students too. all operations for GraphQL, not just queries. But you get your path. So you can say, hey, my query, project query, because we usually tend to give operation names. So in the case of a JetBrains user getting this error, we would say, hey, okay, the JetBrains plugin added in this functionality on the settings page to say whether you have Duo enabled or not before showing a checkbox. That like that's a nice user facing change, right? So we can sort of give them some context to say, hey, you don't have Duo, you can't enable code suggestions. We can give them a better user experience. But what ends up happening though is if we don't develop with the context of, hey, you have users that aren't going to be able to access this API, you have to think of the different error cases. And so this error case is sort of down the happy path. If it was on a GitLab server that was up to date to have this particular field, this wouldn't happen, right? So you get a 200 response because GraphQL tends to give a 200 response unless it's like a catastrophic server error, right? But then you get a list of errors. So then you have to go through and do error handling for the different types of errors you may get. And so what ends up happening is you get a bug report essentially because some functionality it just failed. The IDE will raise an exception if it wasn't caught in the plugin when you're developing. And then you get a JSON response that looks like this. We then have to go back to the user saying, hey, what version are you on? And go back and forth to figure out the context of can we give them a better user experience? And in some cases, the answer ends up being yes. And in some other cases, if the token that they've defined doesn't have enough permissions, it may be no. And so with JetBrains as an example, whenever you input your personal access key, we then at that stage allow you to test your connection. One of the improvements that we can make is when you click test and verify connection, we could open it up and say, hey, I can see you have the API scope, you have the read API scope, you have the AI feature scope. We could tell them, hey, these are the scopes that you've granted on this access token. Are you okay to proceed? Yes. Okay, save that token then. If it's something like API or admin, but we think it's potentially a vulnerable version of an IDE that may have issues with like the secret storage, then we could give them an experience saying, hey, just a warning, if this is an environment you trust in, you're running only trusted plugins, you're probably fine. But if not, you should know that you're running with like a token that has extreme privileges. You don't need it. You can reduce those scopes that you've granted on the token. And so going through and like thinking of those types of use cases where we're able to highlight things earlier to the user. And then once we get into the actual like pass that token, once the token's in, then once we have the token, then we have the ability to look at things like the metadata API, where we can query the milestone that the GitLab instance is on. We can query whether it's enterprise or community edition. And then we can make sure we're developing with keeping those different scenarios in mind. But then the problem becomes like you've developed with all this stuff, but how do you test against all these things? And so in the case of in the case of fields being missing, it's actually really predictable. This format is always a response that the GitLab API will provide if a field is missing. You can go into the GraphQL Explorer today, and then you could just, if you like hammer in some keys on a field that already exists, you can see what that would look like. And so we can see here that if my query is project query and I've got project and my field is uh, do of like features enabled gobbledygook, you can then see this the response would look like. So then you just fix that response to actually look like the real response. And then you sort of see what that error will look like. Now, the reason I'm doing this instead of just typing it in and is because I'm hitting GitLab.com, so that field is always going to exist, even though we get back saying, hey, it's an experimental feature. Because for GitLab.com, when you're querying from GraphQL, you have a session, it goes to the API, but you don't have the ability to pass through the remove deprecated field. So what we do have though is if we're making those requests from the command line, you can test with that in mind. So if we look here, we can say remove deprecated. And so if I do remove deprecated, you can see from the command line in my curl request, I'm able to use a real query. And so we can see query AI access current user Duo code suggestions available. That's a real field. But because I have access to the GraphQL API endpoint directly, I can just add the query parameter in. So then when we hit that, we send that request off. We then get back the exception And you can see here that we have like column 32. So we can see that it goes sort of into the query and then hits the first field that doesn't exist and it bails. And so again, like it's a pretty catastrophic error in terms of like typically GraphQL, you'd expect it to return some data back. And so if you asked for like 5 fields back, you entered your ID, your user, your projects or something. Usually you'd expect to get those fields back, but because a query being like a query's schema being invalid, if it fails schema validation, that because that's catastrophic, you then get back this error, and then you have to do the error handling on that. And so while developing tests, if whenever you're running queries, what ends up being super helpful, I find, is if we run an integration test or a end-to-end test, which actually takes your query and then it sends it just a happy path with like a known good data for any variables that you've got defined. If you can send that query with and without the query parameter, so you can define an integration test which has a query parameter, and then you tell it to run in both forms. And then once you run both of those forms, you've got some regression coverage to see, hey, am I making sure I'm dealing with the error case? And once you're dealing with that error case, we know that we're gonna have a better experience for users in the long run. Um, that sort of like wraps up what's built there. What I would like in the future is if from the GraphQL Explorer, whenever I was dealing with JetBrains for GraphQL Explorer, our GraphQL instance doesn't play well with subscriptions. And so you end up getting subscriptions and trying to use subscriptions and fields. All you get from running it inside of GraphQL is validation of whether your query is syntactically correct, which you automatically get from the client anyways when you send your request. And so that's a problem with Action Cable, and there's different ways to support Action Cable from the browser. And that's just something we'll have to do and address like as like GitLab in the like going forwards. But today's subscriptions just don't work because it tries to use the normal WebSockets connections, which isn't the way we use subscriptions for GraphQL. Um, the other benefit is in a previous role, what we did is we actually modified the GraphQL JS to actually have the ability to inject in variables. And so the way we have query variables here that are effective to my query, we all added in the ability to pass through query parameters. And that way you can have query parameters or custom HTTP headers, which can do things like authentication, authorization, and what you can pass those query parameters and those request headers. You define them. You can modify the like this page here where we actually add in right under query variables. We'd also have a section for request headers or query parameters, and those can be forwarded along to the GraphQL API. Whereas currently all that's supported is variables and the actual query text. And so what we could do is we could add in the ability to do this. And so there's a couple of like other like sort of like sandboxes for GraphQL. GraphQL is totally fine. And like we have the ability to add it in. So we just need to sort of like create an issue around it, jump in and like contribute a change here to actually be able to pass through that remove deprecated field. Like I envision where we have like this like in GraphQL we have like an on-off switch, a toggle which says show deprecated, show experimental fields. You click the toggle and then it gives you the ability to test it directly in GraphQL. And the same thing with subscriptions, because today, like because I wasn't able to test those subscriptions, the sort of like development life cycle took a lot longer. And then by the end of it, I had taken so long to like work out the GraphQL kinks and version compatibility for GraphQL. I didn't even realize that, hey, those GraphQL queries, just if we're dealing with API token that doesn't have XYZ scope, those queries don't work at all. Like you can't use GraphQL if you don't have a specific set of scopes. And whenever that we realize that, it's like, okay, well, you have this sort of like the GitLab milestones to worry about. You have the token authentication scopes to worry about. And then you also have like the sort of the concept of enterprise versus community edition. And then there's obviously permissions like for more granular things where like you may have certain seats for ultimate features for particular users. But that just becomes like much more narrowed down. Like typically those ones, if it's like a specific permission on a user, like it won't be a catastrophic failure like an invalid schema would be. It would typically be back, you get most of the data back, but you get null like on the top level resolver that didn't have the data. So if you there was like maybe a field within a project and that project you didn't have access to, that project would fail, but any other parts of the query at that level, the same level of the project would have come back with data. And so it's just about building queries in a way where we know they're well supported and we can test how they will react in different circumstances. That is more or less where I'm going, and the sort of future of this, and what I would like to do and continue developing. I've sort of like startups and developments on this is using Apollo server. So in a past life, I dealt with federation. So with I used GraphQL Java, and then we had like multiple like sort of circumstances. So there was different regions. So all the data I was sort of trying to think what's not under NA and what is under the NDA. I have given talks in the past on it. But yeah, so what ended up happening is we had 5 regions for data, and for data collection and assessments, what you ended up doing is if you're from particular regions or with if your authentication credentials authorize you to gain wider access, we federated the request to particular services in different regions, like to make sure we're following the like data residency. And so there's sort of like a top level of GraphQL that you would hit. It would act like a gateway. It was Apollo Gateway, and then Apollo Gateway would then delegate to the specific servers. So if you think of groups, so how like if we had the secure, if like secure and then create had 2 different like if we had secure and create, there would be 2 different GraphQL servers, and then each of those teams would totally manage their own schema, and then you can then bubble upwards, or like the request is federated, so any there would be a common schema which defines just a few types or things that need to be matched between other teams. And then from that point, you have people defining like subsets of data, things that are like safe information, which would be like read, and like at that point you can then federate that information upwards. Not That's not too important around the authentication piece. The piece I'm more like interested in talking about is the regional piece. So we had APIs that were regional. There would be experimental APIs released in US, but they weren't ready yet to be released in Japan, for example, because of whatever regulations we had to make sure were signed off by lawyers, etc. And so what would happen is we would be able to use not annotations, but GraphQL directives. So the same way we have like a at deprecated directive, you could give it a at experimental or at regional, and then you give it the sort of like the arguments to the directive, where you could say it's regional, it's US East one, like EU Central, and then it would only be accessible in those regions. And so that's at the top level of the gateway level. So you'd make the request at the gateway level, and it would say, hey, yep, you're making a request to the US gateway instance, and then it would delegate to the correct services. But if you're making a request to the EU or like the Japan instance, which doesn't have the access yet to the API, you could deploy version 3.2, like 1.0 of the software. But even though you've deployed 1.0 of the software, in Japan, because it's put behind a feature flag or a regional flag, you then can have fields that are sort of hidden, right? So the visibility of those fields are hidden. Just the same way we have like these at deprecated fields, like the directives are super powerful. The way we're doing responses with directives we could definitely like clear things up. The benefit of that is you can actually flip that from like editor extensions. From the client side, there's the ability to do schema transformation and to do direct like sort of like transformations based on directives. So when we're using the schema from the extension side, if we start annotating the schema with things like at send, like if we start like introducing new directives like at since, or like so you could say at sense milestone. If you annotate it with that, the editor extension, the clients could know, hey, my version isn't actually compatible with the 16.9 milestone yet. I'm not that new, so don't even send this request or omit these fields from my request. Whereas right now, what ends up happening is there's a couple of directives that are included in the GraphQL spec and that are supported by like the GraphQL Ruby that we're using in GitLab. But those are done after schema validation. And because we're not using we don't know what server we're talking to, you can't send a request that says, hey, @skip this field if condition, because by the time it actually tries to do that, that field wasn't, if it field failed validation, it immediately bails and has that catastrophic error. And well, there's the two alternatives there are either do client side schema stitching, and so there's the concept of stitching, which is a little bit different than federation, but you get the ability to say, hey, I can introspect the GraphQL schema on GitLab.com or the GitLab instance I'm talking to, and I can compare it to the version I was compiled against in the case of like strongly typed languages. So you can do the comparison to say, hey, is there a diff between these two schemas? And you have a concept of, instead of using like for federation, you can use the schema registry. You don't need to do that necessarily. All you need to do is compare the schema that we know and have compiled and tested against in the extension and the actual deployed version, or the version that's available through introspection of the API. And so once you do that comparison, if there's fields that are unavailable, we know that, hey, we should just omit these from the query. And if the query was essentially only an operation for that particular thing, we can also say, hey, we can skip this GraphQL query if the GitLab version isn't new enough. And that's sort of the approach that we've taken in the VS Code extension so far. We sort of gate particular queries by the GitLab version. So yeah, I see there's some chat. That's sort of like the the sort of long of it. I'm happy to do Q&A now if folks have questions.
So there's a doc. Erran, I pasted a link on the Zoom chat and go through those.
Thank you. I'll shut off my screen share.
Yeah, I'll start with my question, just for you, Erran, or for anybody. But let me go to the doc so I can. Mainly, there's an edge case I have in mind behind this, but I was curious how the other extensions work. Where I know the VS Code has a very difficult problem of any instance can have multiple repositories or projects, and GitLab instances. Sorry, any editor instance can have multiple GitLab instances it could communicate, because we detect based on the remote origins, like what are the GitLab instances that you're using here. So the user kind of has to select something, but I just know at the same time is there's a very complicated project model that happens in the VS Code extension, and was curious what the other extensions did with this problem. It sounds like Ali hopped on and shared with JetBrains specifically, you enter what is your GitLab host. But I don't know what was the other. Do we have like a uniform pattern that we want to do with all the extensions here, or what's the thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mean the VS Code pattern is to have more than one host that you can define, right? So you can have more than one host and more than one access token per host, and then based on the remote, we pick which one's appropriate, right? So you could be connected to self-hosted at the same time as you could be connected to .com. But the other extensions don't follow that at the moment, and the other extensions are pretty new as well. So at the moment, I think in the other extensions, you can just have one set of credentials. So you can only say I'm on .com and this is my personal access token, or this is my auth token.
Right. And that makes sense. I think the use case I was thinking in my head, and this is an edge case, but I think it's a signal of like, do we have the right abstraction here? With the introduction of the AI features, we have a lot of features that are now not project specific and require very recent version of GitLab instance. But if me as a user, if my editor instance is based on what repository I'm editing at the moment, if I'm editing something from the GNOME self-managed repository, and at the same time doing something from the GitLab.com, I may all of a sudden have like my AI features not available to me because because I switched to work on a repository that doesn't support those AI features, even though I totally have an account on an instance that does support the AI features. I'm just highlighting like that's a very challenging problem. I know that we keep running into with the VS Code extension. I don't know what the good solutions are, but I am sensing this need to like, there's an instance associated with the project, and then there's just an instance associated with the user because AI features seem project agnostic. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I certainly like the idea of having like a default instance of GitLab to reach out to. I know even in some cases before we had like better self-managed support for AI features, we were having customers who had a GitLab.com account and a self-managed account, and AI features would go to that GitLab.com account. And so I like the idea of having that. But then you obviously you're gonna have cases then where users have like, oh, this data should only go to this server, this should go here. But then I think as long as we keep it sort of constrained to the editor window you're in, if you're like you've got it set up and the remote is already on the correct endpoint, you know.
Yeah, that makes sense. But
Yeah,
yeah, it's a difficult problem.
it's a good
I don't
point.
envy the solution.
It's almost like that first the data model that we need to like we need from a product perspective or requirements, right? So we need to understand, can they connect to both? Do they need to switch credentials? If they don't, what are the sort of data sort of restrictions here, data sharing restrictions, if we connect from one to the other. But then I believe there was an MR not a while ago, not too long ago, where I think now for code suggestions, even if any of the accounts have code suggestions enabled, we just use that. So if a customer's on self-managed or normal, and if as long as one of them has it, I believe we go ahead and uh, request for suggestions. Could be wrong though, but I think that's how
Yeah,
it works.
I mean that makes sense. Uh, yeah, that makes sense. It just those are add to some complexity. Enrique, you were going to say something.
So I
I
shared,
felt like
sorry?
no, I say I felt like I interrupted you. But were you going to say
No,
something?
no, no worries. No, I was just going to share a link to an issue where Tomas is proposing to change the current model that we are using in the extension, where instead of having multiple GitLab accounts, uh, um, like being available to the current VS Code session, only a single one is allowed. It's inheriting from VS Code native account model, where if you want to use a different one, you have to open a new VS Code window. Because like in general, reasoning about that, for example, the change that Shekar was talking about of like choosing an account based on the availability of the code suggestions feature is something that I worked on last year. But it's like extremely complex. And then like we were using a similar model for chat. And what we've seen is that this pattern is spreading across many features because of the problem that Erran is explaining here. That is like the availability of the feature itself changes across accounts. So it's probably like it's it's of great benefit if we can simplify the model, and additionally it could also simplify the underlying code because you only have to deal with a single account.
And that begs the question, do we have to move to like a better version of like better versioning strategy for GraphQL? Or also the other way to do it is have a more flexible schema in the GraphQL where we perhaps just do like I hate to say it, but key value pairs or something where you won't run into like errors, but at least and you can figure out based on those key value pairs whether you have access to certain features. Where it needs a broader discussion for certain.
Yeah. Key value pairs are unfortunate in with the GraphQL because you can't type something as a key value pair of something. You have to make it a list type. But you can make something like a list of yeah, yeah. I've got around that in different ways in the past, and I've never loved it. So I think for me, one of the things is for like in terms of like testability and making sure like we don't regress things. That's one of the things I want to focus on. I've actually started with Apollo server. I've set up an Apollo server, which is just mocking the API. Like you just feed it the latest version of the schema. And then I've started where you like it parses like any fields with that at deprecated, and if it has at deprecated, fortunately, we're pretty consistent today, but we don't technically enforce this through the schema of giving it like a description of, hey, this is experimental, is introduced in 16.9. Right now we can parse that because it's a known string, but really we should be adding an additional directive which says at like since whatever milestone it came out in. I really want to propose that. So if we have that ability, we can then go through the latest schema and find directives and then say, hey, this is where this is from. The problem you get into then is when there's fields that have been deprecated, but then they do get removed from the instance you're talking to, or if they actually get stripped out of the schema, then you're in a situation where you don't know about it. Like you can't have access to that field because the field was removed, and so that's a breaking change, and we unfortunately have to account for that across. Anyways, so yeah.
My next question is short, but I was wondering if we had some uniformity around the self-managed GitLab version that all of the extensions are expected to support. And like, so when, because we can't, it's probably, we don't want to totally commit ourselves to supporting every historical version of GitLab as we move forward. I'm trying to remember like in our and the non-extension development, like when we talked about supporting GitLab versions, it seems like we always support just the last 3 to 4 versions, or
3 versions.
Is it 3 major versions that we
Yeah, so I recently ran into this with support, and they said they support 16,
we
15,
do have like, okay, but if we do have like a regression or security fix, we only fix the last 3 minor versions. And so I think that's what I was thinking in my head, but I don't know what our target is for the extensions in general. Because when we are having all these version checks in our code, okay, when can we actually just conclude that no, you got to update your GitLab instance?
Yeah, Ali, you probably have some opinions on this since you are working on JetBrains. JetBrains has like a massive table of every like JetBrains IDE release that they support. Like there's an IDE platform, then there's the GitLab versions, major versions, and minor versions, and then there's like some more specifics for code suggestions as well.
Yeah, we're using some experimental APIs from JetBrains that are, I guess, sort of in preview stage for inline completions. So they'll kind of throw breaking changes into those IDE APIs whenever they feel like, because they are marked as experimental. So we end up having to deal with that sometimes and let our users know that, hey, the newer version of the plugin isn't going to work with this IDE. And I guess we don't really have a defined policy for support, but that's something we should definitely talk about.
we should create an issue for that, to have a clear policy. Like JetBrains has this additional level of complexity where we also need to support different JetBrains versions. For VS Code, I think we have a policy that we support only the latest version. Is that correct, Enrique?
That's a good question. I know that your extension can say what your minimum VS Code version is, and that also changes like the types. Hopefully you keep that in sync with the VS Code type package that you use to develop your extension. But I would suggest that we don't just support the latest, because I know that some of our more enterprise customers are only going to have certain versions of VS Code for a really long time, and we want to make sure we're supporting as the most minimal version as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I know recently we updated docs I think Lena might have done some of the work on that, in terms of the backend, because as you said, there's the language server version. So the VS Code has a language server client bundled, and so there's specific versions of the language server clients that are required. And so I can see that we say that we have like 1.882, and I think that's because of the language server clients version got out of sync, and there was a couple of like issues reported around that, and it was obviously really quick because, like you said, we just upgraded the language server, upgraded the workflow extension, and then at that stage, once those were in sync, it was fine. But then you have the case of some folks, even though you can say the minimum version, if it's already installed, I think you can in a situation where you could potentially upgrade. So yeah, we've seen someone reporting like an error that we'd found in testing, but like they're the only person who reported in the wild, so they got some interesting situation. I'm not sure how they installed the plugin exactly.
Yeah, someone should draw a three-dimensional map, three-dimensional table of a VS Code version to the GitLab version to feature.
A 3D matrix version matrix sounds 3D version matrix are they're hard enough to parse. I know for certain, and I was working at a company where we were in a closed environment, we had, our artifactory that I would up to our control people artifacts where I like patched the minimum version to support our versions on the inside. So it's like that there's always some sort of shimming around that happens when people are dealing with the raw assets and not just using the marketplace.
Yep. Ali, do you want to verbalize your next question?
Sure, I was wondering if it would make sense to have a shared GitLab instance running an older supported version that we could easily test against, and maybe also run our automated end-to-end tests against.
So I think that'd be amazing if we could have that. I asked the folks on QA. There didn't seem to be one outside of like the instances we have for security patching, just to make sure we have like the latest versions for security patches. So like there's nothing that like past where we support security, like hot fixes, etc. What we do have though is what will probably make sense is I can create an MR for the monolith, because right now there's a script in the GD, if you have GDK and the like in the GitLab repo, you can go to GitLab and say like generate schema, and then once you create that schema.graphqls, like that's your like entire schema. That's all of the GraphQL types that we support. Once you have that, for like if you check out the git tag for each milestone, you can like very quickly build up that, like give or take the GDK trying to like blow up in your face because there's some incompatible update. But if we start like collecting that artifact as a job, and we like whenever we do like a tag pipeline, for example, if we create like a schema.graphqls like artifact, then we could have the ability to like pull that down and use it from, instead of actually having GitLab instances and GDKs running, you have the ability to use it from the likes of like Apollo server. And so this project I have here is actually doing that, where what I have is I have just Apollo server. I pointed at the schema. And so inside of the schema right now, for now, I've just manually defined like the types I'm dealing with, and I know that have these version incompatibilities. What we could do is pass an entire GitLab schema and then just use like mocks. So return fake data. If it's like integers, return like 1 through 10 or something, like if it's a string, give me like a random person's name. If it's an ID, give a UUID back by default. But then you also have the abilities to define custom like resolvers for these for mocking any particular field or mocking a particular return type. And so here, what we can see is, again, we have like those different fields. So we have like the deprecation, that because that's a well-known thing, even though it's not like a separate field which has types for like, hey, early milestone, or like earliest milestone, latest milestone, etc. For like, excuse me, for deprecations. we have the reason there. We can parse that reason string to say, hey, it was introduced in 16.9. And then from there, we can read the, we can actually, what I do here is you can transform the schema, or what you can do is you can transform the like return types. And so in this case, just quickly like to mock it, what I did was I took like, hey, if the context, so the context for context, we can define functions that take in the request and the response. So you can directly modify the HTTP response, but more importantly, you can get request headers. And so here you can see that I'm saying, hey, for context, set the milestone field to whatever the request header was for GitLab GraphQL milestone. And so otherwise, I just do the milestone at builds constant, which is going to be 16.9. And so if you use this, what you end up getting is it sets sets milestone in context whenever that header is present. And if that's the case, you can then simulate the behavior of what's going to happen. And so in the case of, hey, if the milestone was 16.5, and I make this request, throw an exception, and then it will throw the exception, it'll come up in your errors. And so that's using the Apollo server, so it's not the same GraphQL server backend, which is a bit unfortunate. But for clients, it's going to be the same behavior that clients would be expecting. And so my idea is to have this just available as a Docker image that you can have in your CI/CD jobs. And so if you want to do end-to-end testing on stuff, you can, instead of actually hitting all the different versions and having several GitLab instances available at all times for folks to test against, you can instead run this Docker image and pass a few variables to configure the behavior of it. So you can pass, and some of those variables can be controlled with request headers. And so that will obviously do a little bit of tweaking to the client's code. But as well as that is, instead of doing it from the request headers, just giving it the ability where like you can trigger the behavior and configuration by like giving it a like configuration. And so like the sort of idea would be that's like whenever you're running with Docker, you would have like the ability to say like, hey, remove deprecated. And so if remove deprecated was set to true, we could actually transform the schema and strip out all the deprecated fields, which is what we're hiding the visibility in the GraphQL. And so that works the same way that piece there works the same way that with Apollo server and like the gateway that I was talking about earlier that I did like in a past life. Like that's like hiding visibility. So those fields are still there, but because you hide the visibility, you can actually detach the resolver. So you can make the resolver no op. It returns an empty object, or null rather. It can return null as the resolver, and then it hides the visibility, so nobody can even introspect that, hey, is that like, oh, that's field exists. Let me try to like go get that field. It's not sensitive necessarily, but we can still remove those things. Like with authorization and like regional use case, that was all about like sensitivity of data and like not being able to give stuff to people yet. Whereas this would be like, hey, for removing deprecated, we can strip out fields like on the command line, just saying, hey, we know we're going to do that. So whenever it reads in the schema version from whatever, like for whichever GitLab schema it reads in, it will then just remove all deprecated fields. We could also pass in things like we could have like a catalog of those like if we start storing a schema.graphqls like schema definition file for every like tagged version of GitLab, we could then like point that, like you could maybe point it to a URL, or you can even like point it to the version number, and then it can go and retrieve that like artifact from the pipeline. And then once it has that, then you could potentially still do the schema transformations when it makes sense. Or you could like the schema transformation sort of like helps you test for future changes. Whereas you could also say, like if we have the tagged artifact, we can point at a different like schema GraphQL to mock essentially. So it'll mock all the stuff in a schema definition file that you give it. And so having that ability would like as a Docker job, I think would just like make things a lot easier than going through and finding GitLab instances, running GDK, making sure your GDK license is correct for things like Community Edition, Ultimates Premium, etc. So yeah, sorry, rambled on there. I think there's a couple more questions in the doc.
We're almost at time. Actually, I think we're beyond time. I think Enrique just dropped out. But he had his last question, which I think Erran, you already answered. So with that, thanks a lot, everyone, for joining. And thanks a lot, Erran, for conducting this amazing session, which is, really had a good discussion around it as well. So thank you.
Thanks
All
all.
right. Thank you, everyone.